Okay, so the Protestant Reformation is something that we need to talk about, spend some time on. At the same time that Western Europe was settling in the Americas and establishing trade in the Indian Ocean, the Christian church in Western Europe was becoming extremely unsettled. Now, we use the words Protestant Reformation and Christianity here in this unit. Protestant because the leaders and the believers in this movement were protesting against the Catholic Church. Now, Reformation because they believed that their ideas would truly reform the Catholic Church and the idea of Christianity. And lastly, the word Christianity originated during this time period because it was an important distinction for the members of the Protestant faith. They believed in the salvation and faith of Jesus Christ, not the church. And so they were Christ followers, not church followers. And that was an important distinction for them. Now, the Renaissance is something that we've discussed before. It began in the city-states of northern Italy, and it gradually spread to the states of northern Europe. Now, this was called the Northern Renaissance, and it was characterized by a more intense religious devotion than the Italian Renaissance. And Martin Luther was a German monk, actually a former monk, that was living in Germany at the time, so he was kind of a product of this Northern Renaissance. In 1517, to finance the restoration of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, the Roman Catholic Church authorized the sale of indulgences. An indulgence is simply a document that grants the purchaser a forgiveness of sins. And they had all different kinds of values. Sometimes they were artifacts. There was a prince, a Habsburg prince that was said to own like 37,000 of these things. And what makes them really controversial is that if you are wealthy, then that means that you can pretty much, the Catholic Church is promoting this idea that you can buy your way into heaven. And it also allowed you to do some pretty bad things if you thought you could just pay $100 or whatever the conversion would be to the church and not have anything happen to you. You just buy a little piece of paper. And peasants and, the lower classes weren't afforded this. So it was a very controversial practice. So Martin Luther, who was he was a German priest and a former monk, he responded to this sale of indulgences with the 95 Theses. And basically what the 95 Theses started out as was a letter to Archbishop who's essentially his boss, and that was seeking clarification on church positions. And it became known as the 95 Theses. Now, I don't know why my pictures are all messed up like this. I'm sorry. But the 95 Theses, this is a famous painting right here of him nailing it to the door. The 95 Theses, were they really nailed to that church door in Wittenberg? More than likely not. A lot of historians argue about it, but most historians agree that there's not a lot of truth to it. But it doesn't really matter because they still had such an enormous effect. The 95 Theses, he's railing against the sale of indulgences. I mean, he just absolutely digs into the church for that one. And then he also starts to talk about the doctrine of justification. And this was the idea that God declares a sinner righteous alone in God's grace. That you do not have to be somebody who lives to, and doing all these rituals and stuff that the Catholic Church requires. That if you have faith in God and in Jesus Christ as his son, as the Messiah, then you have salvation. And this was very controversial because the church did not teach that. The church believed that you live a good life in accordance of God's will, and then God will grant you salvation. But in order to live that good life, you have to, give to the church and be involved in the church, etc., etc. This concept of equality that Martin Luther was preaching appealed to many Europeans, especially the ones in the lower classes and the peasant classes, because, it no longer seemed to center around money. It was more about faith and who you were. Luther's study of the Bibles had led him to believe that salvation was obtained only through faith in Jesus Christ as the Savior of the world from sin. It was not dependent on following church practices and traditions. Women were afforded no position in this, however. And Martin Luther was approached by the church numerous times. He refused to recant, even under threat of arrest and torture. Eventually, Pope Leo X excommunicated him in 1521. Now, what's important is that the movable type definitely helped spread the teachings of Luther. We've talked about him before, but Johann Gutenberg in the 15th century printed the Gutenberg Bible. It was written in Latin, but eventually the movable type helped spread not only his 95 Theses, but Martin Luther actually in 1521 began translating the New Testament into vernacular German for more people. Now, the political climate in Europe was already kind of boiling over. Henry VIII of England broke with the Roman Catholic Church over the Pope's refusal to annul his first marriage. He was in search of a male heir. And then, under Henry's daughter Elizabeth I, England officially recognized Protestantism. So that was a really big deal. Now, and nationalism in the German states were really, or nationalism was sweeping through the German states, and they were looking for a reason to get rid of the Catholic Church in their country anyway. And then you had John Calvin, and what he did was begin preaching predestination, which was an idea that was carried all the way to North America and is still alive in some places of the world, but he ultimately founded the Presbyterian Church. The Protestant Reformation produced a movement within the Roman Catholic Church to consider Protestant charges against it. As a result of this Counter-Reformation, or the Catholic Reformation, Church Assembly, the Council of Trent, abandoned the sale of indulgences. However, they preserved traditional Roman Catholic beliefs and practices, and one of the big things that they said was that the Bible could only be interpreted by a member of the church, by a member of the clergy. And that was a big break from Protestantism, because Martin Luther believed that everybody should be able to own a Bible and read it for themselves and interpret it for themselves. But another big thing that came out of the Council of Trent was the Jesuits, the organization of the Jesuits. And we're going to talk about them in the next video.